Hey everybody, welcome back. This is part 4. This is the last part in this series. We've gone ahead and we've decided which shims we're going to use to replace the ones where we had an insufficient gap. And here you can see that just lift the bucket, take the old shim out, and replace it with the shim that you've chosen, and then replace the bucket. I recommend doing this one valve at a time. That way you don't start getting parts mixed up. And make sure to keep things nice and oiled as you reinstall them. That way when you start the engine back up, there's a nice fresh coat of oil to keep things from heating up and damaging parts in the engine. So just go one valve at a time, remove the bucket, take the shim out, replace it with the one that you're going to use, reinstall the bucket. And then we're going to get into reinstalling the cam and the cam ladder and going through the torque sequence.
All right, now we get all our shims back in. Time to put our cam back into place. Lift up the chain, carefully guide the cam in, and gently down on the journals. And for this, I marked where my chain went before I took these cams out. So if you'll notice, there's one of my marks for the exhaust cam, and there's the other mark for the intake cam. Making sure I get my chain back to where it was. That way when I start to torque this down, reapply tension, this should go right back to where it was, top dead center. So next step is we're going to get our O-rings in place down here on the dowel rods and where the spark plugs go in, and then we'll reinstall our ladder and start torquing it down so we can recheck our valve clearance, and hopefully it'll all be good, and then start patching everything back up, get this thing back on the road where we want it. Now I know that there's a different process the manual calls for, but I feel like it's way overcomplicated, so we're not doing it that way. We marked our chain where it came off. It went back on in the same exact spot. Our timing hasn't shifted, so we can still see our lines on the cams. Now, it does call for the bearing surfaces for the cams to the ladder to have a 50-50 solution of motor oil and molybdenum disulfide. So I just mixed up a little bit of that. It also says to lubricate the ladder bolts with oil, so we did that. And I went around and I put 50 weight oil on all of the cams, the lobes, everywhere they're gonna want oil first when this thing first starts. So we'll get our ladder down here. We installed new O-rings. And put our dowels back in that go between the ladder and the cylinder head. We'll get all these little bolts started, and then we're going to go back and do an initial torque in sequence, and then go back through and do a secondary torque at a higher rate, also in sequence. And at that point, we'll be able to recheck our valve clearances and see if the new shims brought everything back into spec. All right, now we're going to start torquing in sequence. It calls for the first round of torque to be 5 Newton meters. That's about 44 inch-pounds. Not all torque wrenches will have Newton meter scales on them, so you'll need to just Google a conversion. All right, we're at the point where we need to reinstall our cam chain tensioner. So you'll have to reset this. And the way you're going to need to do that is, you'll notice there's 2 springs. One of them has kind of a bend in each end. May not be able to see it, but it'll be the lower one here. And you squeeze those together. And then pull out the piston. You can leave the spring in, and then you're going to dump whatever oil is left in there into a waste receptacle. Then you put this back in. You'll do the same thing with those 2 little spring ends. Just pinch them together so that you can get the piston back in. And then what you're going to do is just hold them together and push it all the way back in. And then once you get it down, there's the second snap ring. Once that groove lines up with the outer snap ring, push one end of it over and it'll capture the piston. Then from there we're going to install our new gaskets and install it back in the engine. Alright, so now that we've got our chain tensioner installed, we're going to carefully remove our wedge here, or in my case, a piece of wood. Make sure not to damage anything, obviously. And then make sure that if you have the engine crank pin tool that goes down here, to go ahead and remove it. Now to release it, we're going to turn the crank a 1/4 turn counterclockwise. So I'm just using an F wrench here. I'm going to kind of hold this pin in and hold a little pressure on the tensioner as I do this. Just nice and slow. Okay. I'm not even sure I got a 1/4 turn out of that, but now I can definitely feel the tension on the chain. I'll go just a little bit more just to say I did the whole 1/4 turn. It was about a 1/4 turn. All right. So got our chain tensioner in, and we had our blade on track. Okay, and we made sure to hold it, and then we turned the crankshaft a 1/4 turn counterclockwise. Now we're going to turn it back to where we can see the alignment marks in the crank to make sure everything lines up. And then we're going to take it through 4 revolutions and then make sure that the timing on the cams are where they're supposed to be. Obviously we're doing this. I'm going to look to see if my dot on the crank and the line here are back lined up, and they are. So I think that's good to go. We'll move on to the next step. All right, so now that we have the cam chain tensioner reinstalled, our cams are reinstalled, the timing is back, what we want to do now is, I think this is a better spot to be rechecking your valve, since you're going to be turning over the engine in order to check each valve lobe. So we'll go through now and we'll recheck our valve adjustment measurements, make sure they're back in spec with the new shims, and then we'll install a new gasket here, some new spark plugs, and we'll start putting this thing back together. And hopefully you've got the service manual by now, so it's basically just step by step in reverse of how we took it apart. All right, we're going to be tightening up the camshaft cover. There's 6 bolts, and you do torque these in sequence. It's going to be 1, 2, 3, then 4, then 5, and then 6. So that'll be in your manual. It'll show you. You'll notice that some of these will be very difficult to get a wrench on, whereas some you can use your torque wrench and go straight on. You might be able to do that for about a whole 1 bolt. So what they don't really make readily available at AutoZone is an offset. So what I did is I went and got a pack of 1/4-inch drive Allen hex keys in metric, and what I'm going to do is set my torque wrench to the 10 Newton meters that these bolts are going to get torqued to. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use one of the hex drives that I don't need, because I need the 6mm actually go on the fastener. So the other one, I'm going to use that 1/4-inch shank to put through a 1/4-inch wrench, and then I will place my bit, the 6mm bit, onto the fastener, and then my 1/4-inch wrench can grab on. So now I'm at an offset. Now, if you know anything about torque wrenches, it's that if you're going to use an offset and you don't want to have to calculate the difference in torque based on the position of your offset, always keep it at 90 degrees. If it's at 90 degrees, then the torque that the wrench is set to is equal to the amount of torque applied to the fastener. If you start to change this and you have your torque wrench out at 0 degrees or any other angle other than 90 degrees to the head of the wrench, you're going to have to calculate the difference in torque. I don't see an issue at this point with being able to get this particular setup where I need it at 90 degrees to do these torques. But if you decide that you need to position this offset at any other angle, you're going to want to look up how to calculate the difference in torque from that difference in offset, and then you'll have to set your wrench accordingly, because if it's out more than 90 degrees, you're applying a greater amount of torque to the fastener than what's indicated on the wrench. So you kind of you have to back off. I recommend just keep it at 90 degrees. That way the torque is what it is on the wrench. No math. No math is good, right? So for the first one, we actually don't need this setup. And so I'm gonna just go ahead and torque this one regularly, and then I'll start using my offset for the other ones.
Once you finish torquing, go ahead and reinstall your secondary air injection, valve covers, and the hoses. And you're going to start reinstalling the throttle bodies and make sure that you get it seated all the way down onto the transition pieces, and then go ahead and tighten those clamps up. Right here, when you're trying to get these hoses in, it's always good to have pictures to refer back to. So I recommend, as you are disassembling the motorcycle, take pictures abundantly. They're cheap, they're digital, you can delete them when you don't need them, but trust me, they'll be very helpful when you're trying to figure out where all these hoses went, because you can't remember when you took them off 3 weeks ago because you've been waiting on parts. Next, go ahead and install your air box and your new air filter from your service kit and tighten all the screws down. Next is you're going to be installing the gas tank. Take your time here. Also, when you're reconnecting the electrical connectors to the fuel pump and the tank, just make sure you get them seated all the way in.
So once I fire it up, let that fuel pump come up to pressure. I want to look around and see if there's any fuel leaking, because we disconnected those hoses and we don't want those to leak when we start firing this thing up, because that could catch fire. So, looks like we're doing okay. Not seeing any fuel. Let's give her a crank. Well, it's all back together.
minus an upper crash bar. And next thing we'll do is we'll plug in the OBD link connector and reset the service wrench. If you wonder how to do that, I have a couple of videos. Make sure you watch both of them because one of them is an update. You have to have an account on their forum now. But other than that, you plug it in, you can reset your service wrench yourself. You don't have to have the dealer to do that. All right, well, if there's any questions about how it all went back together, please feel free to hit me up.